The sound of the slap echoed through Rosie's diner like a gunshot. Every conversation stopped. Every fork froze halfway to every mouth. Every head turned toward the back booth where 72-year-old Margaret Thompson sat holding her cheek, her coffee now spilled across the table, dripping onto her lap. Standing over her was Karen Mitchell, red-faced and furious, her hand still raised from the blow she'd just delivered. "That's what you get for not moving fast enough, old woman," Karen snarled. "Some of us have places to be, and we don't have time to wait for senile old folks to shuffle around taking up space." Margaret's hands were shaking as she tried to wipe the hot coffee from her pants. At 72, she moved a little slower than she used to, especially with the arthritis that had settled into her knees after decades of standing at nursing stations during her 40 years as an Army nurse. I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling. "I was just trying to reach my wallet to pay my check." "Well, you were blocking the entire aisle," Karen snapped. "And when I tried to get past you, you had the nerve to tell me to wait a moment." "Wait? Who do you think you are to tell me to wait?" Rosie Chun, the diner's owner, came rushing over from behind the counter. "Ma'am, please calm down. There's no need for violence in my establishment." "Violence?" Karen laughed harshly. "That wasn't violence. That was a wake-up call for this old hag to learn some manners and move faster. Maybe if her generation wasn't so entitled and slow, the rest of us wouldn't have to deal with them clogging up every public space." Margaret's hand was still pressed against her reddening cheek. She could feel the hot sting of tears forming in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She'd faced worse than this during her 2 tours in Vietnam. During the years of racism and sexism she'd endured as a black woman in the military, during the decades of fighting for respect in a world that often gave her none. But somehow, being slapped in a diner at 72 years old by a woman young enough to be her daughter felt like a new kind of humiliation. "I think you should leave," Rosie said firmly to Karen. "Right now. I'll leave when I'm good and ready," Karen shot back. "And I'm not paying for my meal either. The service here is terrible, and having to deal with obstacles like her ruins the whole experience." She pointed at Margaret with disgust. "Ma'am, I'm calling the police," Rosie said, reaching for her phone. "Go ahead," Karen replied smugly. "Call them. I'll tell them about how this old woman was blocking the aisle and refusing to move when I politely asked her to. I'll tell them about how she was muttering disrespectfully under her breath. I have rights, you know. I shouldn't have to deal with people like her when I'm trying to enjoy my lunch. People like her." The phrase hung in the air, heavy with implications that everyone in the diner understood perfectly. Margaret finally found her voice. "I'm sorry I was in your way," she said with dignity. "But there was no need to hit me. I'm a 72-year-old woman. I was simply trying to—" "I don't care how old you are," Karen interrupted. "Age doesn't give you the right to be rude and inconsiderate. Maybe if your generation had taught your children better manners, we wouldn't have the problems we have in this country today." She grabbed her purse and headed toward the door. "And I'm still not paying for my meal. Swimming." As Karen reached for the door handle, it swung open from the outside. A man in an expensive suit walked in, followed by 2 other people in business attire. He was tall, around 45, with kind eyes and an air of authority that filled the room immediately. "Mom?" he said, his eyes landing on Margaret still sitting in the booth, holding her reddening cheek. "Mom, what happened?" Margaret's eyes widened. "Marcus? What are you doing here?" Marcus Thompson, United States District Court judge and one of the most respected legal minds in the state, quickly crossed the diner to his mother's side. "I was driving by and saw your car in the parking lot," he said, his voice tight with concern as he gently took her hand away from her face to examine her cheek. "I thought I'd surprise you with lunch. Who did this to you?" "It's nothing, baby," Margaret said, embarrassed. "Just a misunderstanding." "That's not nothing," Marcus said, his jaw clenching as he saw the clear handprint on his mother's dark skin. "Someone hit you." Karen, who had frozen by the door, suddenly seemed to realize the situation she was in. Her face had gone pale, and she was slowly backing toward the exit. "It was her," Rosie spoke up, pointing at Karen. "That woman slapped your mother, and has been verbally abusing her for the past 5 minutes. Marcus turned to look at Karen, his expression cold and hard. You slapped my mother? It wasn't. She was blocking the aisle and... Karen stammered. You slapped my 72-year-old mother. Marcus repeated, his voice deadly quiet. She was being rude. She wouldn't move when I asked her to. I barely touched her. And she's making a big deal out of nothing. Karen's voice was getting shrill with panic. Marcus pulled out his phone and called 911. This is Judge Margaret Thompson. I'm at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street, and I need police officers here immediately to file an assault report. My mother, a 72-year-old woman and Vietnam War veteran, was just physically slapped and assaulted. Karen's face went from pale to green. Judge? You're a judge. Marcus ignored her, speaking calmly into the phone. Yes, the assailant is still on the premises. No, my mother doesn't require medical attention at this time, but I'd like officers here to document the assault and the witness statements. Wait, please, Karen said desperately. I didn't know. It wasn't that serious. She's fine. Look at her. She's fine. Marcus ended the call and turned his full attention to Karen. Let me make sure I understand the situation, he said in the measured tone he used in his courtroom. You slapped an elderly woman because she was moving too slowly for your convenience. Is that correct? It wasn't like that. Did you or did you not slap my mother? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Technically, yes, but... And did you then refuse to pay for your meal and verbally abuse her with ageist and, I suspect, racist language? I never said anything racist. Karen protested. She said people like her, another diner called out. Multiple times. We all heard it. And she called her an old hag, someone else added. She said Margaret's generation was entitled and should learn manners, Rosie contributed. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Karen's face. So we have assault, battery, theft of services, and potentially a hate crime. That's quite an afternoon you've had. Hate crime? Are you insane? I'm not a racist. Karen was nearly screaming now. That will be for the police and the district attorney to determine, Marcus said calmly. But I can tell you that as someone who has presided over hundreds of cases, the facts as I'm hearing them described paint a fairly clear picture. Karen suddenly changed tactics, her voice becoming pleading. Please, Judge Thompson, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I was having a bad day, and I took it out on the wrong person. If I'd known she was your mother. If you'd known she was my mother? Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. So, it would have been acceptable to slap someone else's elderly mother? Someone else's veteran? Someone else's grandmother? No, that's not what I meant. My mother, Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly, is Margaret Thompson. She served 2 tours as an Army nurse in Vietnam. She's been a registered nurse for 40 years. She's volunteered at the VA hospital every week for the past 20 years, helping veterans who are struggling with PTSD and physical injuries. She raised 3 children as a single mother after my father died, and she put all of us through college while working double shifts. He paused, his voice dropping back to that cold, quiet tone that was somehow more frightening than yelling. She is a decorated veteran, a respected healthcare professional, and one of the kindest, most patient people I have ever known. And you slapped her because she was moving too slowly in a diner. Tears were streaming down Karen's face now. I'm so sorry. Please, I'll apologize. I'll pay for her meal. I'll pay for everyone's meal. Please don't press charges. Margaret finally spoke up. Marcus, baby, maybe we should just let it go. She's clearly sorry, and I'm fine. No real harm done. Marcus looked at his mother with a mixture of love and exasperation. Mom, you've been letting things go your whole life. You let people disrespect you, push you around, and treat you like you're less than human because of your age and your race. And you always take the high road, always forgive, always move on. That's how I was raised, son. Turn the other cheek. I know, Mom, and I love you for your grace and your compassion. But someone needs to stand up for you. Someone needs to show people like her that there are consequences for treating others with cruelty. He turned back to Karen. You're going to be charged with assault and battery. You're going to pay for your meal, my mother's meal, and everyone else's meal in this diner. You're going to issue a formal apology to my mother in front of all these witnesses. And then you're going to accept whatever consequences the legal system deems appropriate. But I could lose my job, Karen wailed. I work in marketing. If I have a criminal record, I'll be fired. You should have thought about that before you slapped an elderly woman, Marcus replied without sympathy. The police arrived within minutes. They took statements from Margaret, Rosie, and several witnesses. They photographed Margaret's cheek, which was now deeply bruised. They listened as Marcus calmly laid out the sequence of events and the applicable laws that had been violated. Karen Mitchell was arrested and charged with assault and battery. She was also cited for theft of services for refusing to pay for her meal. As the officers led her away in handcuffs, she was still crying and protesting that it wasn't fair, that she'd made a mistake, that she didn't deserve this. After the police left, Marcus sat down in the booth across from his mother. Are you really okay? He asked gently. Margaret nodded, though her hands were still shaking slightly. I've survived worse, baby. Much worse. I know you have, but you shouldn't have to. Not at 72 years old. Not after everything you've been through and everything you've accomplished. People have been treating me like this my whole life, Margaret said quietly. Being black, being a woman, being old now. There's always someone who thinks they're better than me, who thinks I should move faster or speak quieter or take up less space in the world. And that's exactly why I'm not letting this go, Marcus said firmly. Because you deserve better. Because every elderly person deserves to eat lunch without being assaulted. Because every veteran deserves respect. Because every human being deserves basic dignity. Rosie came over with a fresh cup of coffee and a slice of pie. On the house, Margaret. And I'm so sorry that happened in my diner. It's not your fault, Rosie, Margaret said with a tired smile. Judge Thompson, Rosie said, your mother comes in here 3 times a week. She always leaves generous tips, always has a kind word for everyone, and she helped my daughter with her nursing school applications last year. She's beloved in this community. What happened today was an outrage. Marcus nodded. Thank you for speaking up and calling the police. After Rosie walked away, Marcus took his mother's hand. Mom, I want to ask you something. Why do you keep accepting this kind of treatment? Why do you always turn the other cheek? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, stirring sugar into her coffee. Because I remember what it was like before, she finally said. I remember when I couldn't eat in diners like this one because of the color of my skin. I remember when people called me names that were far worse than old hag. I remember when violence against people like me was accepted, even encouraged. She looked up at her son with eyes that had seen too much, but somehow still held warmth. So when someone like that woman treats me poorly today, part of me thinks, at least I'm allowed to be here. At least I'm allowed to exist in this space, even if someone doesn't like it. I've spent my whole life fighting battles. Marcus, sometimes I'm just tired of fighting. Marcus felt tears forming in his own eyes. You shouldn't have to fight anymore, Mom. That's what my generation is here for. We're supposed to fight the battles so you can rest. I know, baby, and I'm grateful for that. But you need to understand something. She squeezed his hand. When you grow up being told you're less than everyone else, part of you starts to believe it. Even when you know it's not true, even when you've accomplished great things, there's still that little voice in your head that says maybe you do deserve to be treated poorly. Mom, let me finish, she said gently. That woman today? She reminded me of every person who ever made me feel small, who ever made me question my worth, who ever made me think I should apologize for existing. And for a moment, I believed her. I believed that I was in the wrong for moving too slowly, for taking up space, for being an inconvenience to someone younger and more important. She smiled sadly. But then my son walked in, my brilliant, successful, powerful son who became a federal judge, and I remembered something important. I remember that I raised you. I raised all 3 of my children to be strong, educated, successful people who stand up for what's right. And if I could do that, then I must be worth something, right? Marcus was openly crying now. Mom, you're worth everything. You always have been. You didn't need to raise successful children to prove your worth. You were worthy the day you were born, and nothing anyone says or does can change that. I know that now, baby. Thanks to you. 3 months later, Karen Mitchell stood in Marcus Thompson's courtroom for sentencing after pleading guilty to assault and battery. Her lawyer had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Marcus had recused himself from the case, and the judge who took over had no sympathy for someone who assaulted an elderly veteran. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Patterson said sternly, the court has reviewed your case thoroughly. While this is your first offense, the nature of your crime is particularly troubling. You slapped a 72-year-old woman, a decorated veteran, because you felt she was inconveniencing you. You then compounded this assault with verbal abuse and attempted to avoid responsibility for your actions. Karen stood silently, her head bowed. You will complete 300 hours of community service at the VA hospital, working directly with elderly veterans. You will attend anger management classes, participate in restorative justice counseling, and write a formal letter of apology to Mrs. Thompson. You will also pay a fine of $2,000 and cover all of Mrs. Thompson's medical expenses. Any violation of these terms will result in additional penalties. Judge Patterson paused, looking at Karen over her glasses. I want to be clear, Ms. Mitchell. You are receiving leniency because of Mrs. Thompson's generosity. She wrote a letter to this court asking for mercy on your behalf, stating that she believed you could learn from this experience and become a better person. The court is honoring her wishes. But let me also be clear about something else. Our elderly citizens, our veterans, and our community members of all ages and races deserve to move through the world without fear of violence or harassment. What you did was inexcusable, and if you appear before this court again for any similar offense, you will face much harsher penalties. After the sentencing, Karen was required to meet with Margaret as part of her formal apology. They met at Rosie's Diner at Margaret's request. Karen walked in nervous and ashamed, her hands shaking as she approached the booth where Margaret sat with a cup of coffee. Mrs. Thompson, Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for what I did to you. There's no excuse for my behavior. Margaret gestured to the seat across from her. Sit down, child. Karen sat, her eyes filling with tears. I've spent the last 3 months in therapy, Karen said, trying to understand why I did what I did. My therapist says I have unresolved anger issues stemming from my childhood. My parents were very controlling, and I developed a need to control my environment and the people in it. When you didn't move immediately when I wanted you to, it triggered something in me. That's not an excuse, she added quickly. I'm just trying to explain what I've learned about myself. Margaret nodded slowly. We all have our demons, Karen. The question is what we do with them. I know I hurt you, Karen continued, and I know nothing I say can undo that. But I want you to know that I've started volunteering at the VA hospital beyond just my required hours. I've been reading to some of the older veterans, helping them write letters to their families, just sitting with them so they're not alone. She paused, wiping her eyes. There's a man there named Albert. He's 78, and he's serving Korea. He reminds me a bit of you, quiet, dignified, patient with people like me who don't deserve his kindness. He told me about the discrimination he faced when he came home from war, about how people treated him like he was invisible or worthless, even though he'd risked his life for his country. Karen looked up at Margaret with red eyes. I never understood that before. I never understood what it was like to be treated as less than human because of things you can't control, like your age or your race. I never understood the weight that people like you carry, the constant burden of having to prove your worth to people who've already decided you're worthless. But I'm learning, she said, and I want to be better. I want to be the kind of person who adds kindness to the world instead of cruelty. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying the younger woman across from her. Do you know why I asked for leniency for you? She finally asked. Karen shook her head. Because I saw something in your eyes that day. Behind all the anger and the ugliness, I saw fear. I saw someone who was lashing out at the world because they were hurting inside. I still see that person, Margaret continued. But I also see someone who's trying to change, someone who's doing the hard work of becoming better. That's worth encouraging. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Karen whispered. Maybe not, Margaret agreed. But I'm giving it to you anyway, not because you deserve it, but because I choose to. Because holding on to anger and resentment only hurts me, not you. Because I believe people can change if they truly want to. She reached across the table and took Karen's hand. But understand this, Karen. Forgiveness doesn't mean what you did was okay. It means I'm choosing not to let it poison my life. You still have to live with what you did. You still have to do the work of changing. Forgiveness is my gift to myself, not to you. Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. And thank you. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. 1 year later, Karen Mitchell had completed her probation with honors. She logged over 500 hours at the VA hospital, far exceeding her required service. She'd become a regular volunteer, developing deep friendships with many of the veterans she served. She'd also started a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating ageism and supporting elderly citizens in her community. And once a month, she met Margaret Thompson for lunch at Rosie's Diner, where they'd formed an unlikely friendship built on forgiveness, growth, and the recognition that everyone deserved a chance to be better than their worst moment. Margaret never forgot what happened that day, and her cheek had healed but left a faint scar that sometimes ached when the weather changed. But she'd also gained something she hadn't expected, the knowledge that her son's love and her own strength were powerful enough to turn even the ugliest moments into opportunities for growth and redemption. Marcus still checked on his mother constantly, worried that she was too forgiving, too kind, too willing to give people second chances they didn't deserve. But Margaret understood something her son was still learning, that forgiveness wasn't weakness, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was choose grace over vengeance. The world has enough anger, she told Marcus during one of their weekly dinners. What it needs is more people willing to believe in redemption. Even for people who hurt you, especially for people who hurt me, Margaret replied. Because if someone as broken as Karen can change, become kind, and learn to see the humanity in others, then maybe there's hope for all of us. Marcus looked at his mother with a mixture of admiration and wonder. You're extraordinary, you know that? Margaret smiled and patted his hand. No, baby. I'm just an old woman who's learned that love is stronger than hate, and forgiveness is more powerful than revenge. And sometimes, she added with a knowing look, having a son who's a federal judge doesn't hurt either. They both laughed, and in that moment, surrounded by the love of family and the peace that comes from choosing grace over bitterness, Margaret Thompson knew that she had won. Not because justice had been served, though it had. Not because her assailant had been punished, though she had. But because she had refused to let cruelty make her cruel, refused to let hate make her hateful, and refused to let one person's worst moment define either of their futures. That was the real victory, and it was worth more than any revenge could ever be. What did you think of Margaret's choice to forgive? Do you believe in second chances for people who've caused harm? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please share it with others who might need to hear this message about dignity, justice, and the power of forgiveness.